The moment the judge finalized the divorce, she didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply leaned back in her chair with a calm, controlled expression that said everything, without needing words, because this wasn't a victory she had just achieved in that courtroom. It was one she had been building toward for months, maybe even years, carefully positioning every detail, every document, every argument in a way that made the outcome feel inevitable long before the decision was officially spoken. And as I sat there watching it all settle into reality, I realized something that didn't hit like a shock, but like a slow, heavy understanding. This wasn't about the end of a marriage. It was about the execution of a plan that had been unfolding quietly right in front of me without me ever fully recognizing what it was becoming. She had taken everything that could be measured, the house, the accounts, the assets that represented years of work and stability, and she did it with a precision that made it feel less like a separation and more like a transfer of ownership, because that's what it really was. Not an emotional resolution, but a calculated redistribution. And what made it harder to process wasn't just the loss itself, but the realization of how structured it all had been, how every piece seemed to fall into place in a way that left no room for resistance, no opportunity to challenge what had already been framed so convincingly as fair and justified. People often imagine that moments like this are filled with visible emotion, anger, frustration, confrontation, but the reality is far quieter, far more controlled. Because when everything has already been decided long before the final moment arrives, there's nothing left to argue about, nothing left to fight for in a way that can actually change the outcome. And that silence, that absence of reaction, is what makes it feel even heavier. Because it suggests that the real conflict didn't happen here. It happened earlier in moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but were actually shaping everything that would eventually lead to this. What she didn't take, what she didn't even ask about, was the one thing that didn't appear on any list, didn't exist in any document, something so small, so easy to overlook, that it never became part of the conversation. And that absence is what made it important, because in situations like this, people focus on what they can see, what they can quantify, what they can claim with legal certainty, and in doing so they often ignore the things that don't immediately present themselves as valuable, the things that sit quietly outside the structure of negotiation, waiting to reveal their significance at a time when it can no longer be easily managed. That box had been in my possession for years long before the marriage reached the point where everything began to fracture, and its importance wasn't obvious unless you knew exactly what it contained, which is why it never became part of any discussion, never raised any suspicion. Because to anyone else it looked like nothing more than a collection of old items, something personal, something without measurable value, and that perception is exactly what allowed it to remain untouched, unnoticed, completely outside the process that had stripped everything else away. As I left the courtroom that day carrying nothing that could be considered significant in a traditional sense, I didn't feel the kind of defeat that people might expect, because loss isn't always defined by what is taken from you. Sometimes it's defined by what remains, by what you still have that hasn't been recognized yet, and that understanding created a sense of calm that didn't match the situation on the surface, because while everything visible had been removed, something far more important had been left behind, not by accident, but by oversight. She walked out of that building believing the situation was complete, that every outcome had been secured, that nothing had been left unresolved, and in a way she was right, at least from the perspective she had been operating within, because everything she had focused on, everything she had planned for, had been achieved exactly as intended. And when someone reaches that level of certainty, they stop looking for what they might have missed. They stop questioning whether there's something outside their current understanding, because as far as they can see, there's nothing left to consider. But certainty can be misleading, especially when it's built on incomplete information, because it creates a sense of closure that isn't actually there, belief that everything has been accounted for, when in reality something important remains hidden just outside that framework. And that's what made this situation different, because while she believed she had reached the end of the process, the most significant part of it hadn't even begun yet. The box stayed with me untouched, unchanged its presence, quiet but constant, and I didn't rush to open it or act on it immediately. Because timing matters in situations like this, not in a dramatic sense, but in a strategic one. Because the impact of something isn't just determined by what it is, but by when it's revealed, and revealing something too early can reduce its effect. By revealing it at the right moment can completely shift the outcome in ways that can't be undone. Weeks passed, and from everything I could see, she had settled into her new position, comfortably adjusting to the life she had secured, moving forward without hesitation. Without any indication that something had been left behind, and that confidence, that sense of completion, is what made the next part unavoidable, because when someone believes they have full control of a situation, they don't prepare for disruption. They don't anticipate that something outside their awareness could still exist. It wasn't until the first official letter arrived at her new address that the illusion of completion began to fracture, and even then it didn't happen all at once. Because disruption rarely announces itself in a dramatic way. It starts subtly with something that feels out of place, but not immediately alarming, something that can be explained away if you don't look at it too closely, and that's exactly what this was. A single envelope, formal, precise, carrying information that didn't align with the version of reality she believed she had secured, and at first it probably felt like a minor mistake, a clerical issue, something that could be corrected with a phone call. But the problem with unexpected details is that they rarely exist in isolation. They tend to connect to something larger. Inside that envelope was the first indication that something had been overlooked, not in an obvious way, not in a way that immediately revealed its full significance, but in a manner that raised just enough uncertainty to create discomfort. And discomfort is where awareness begins, because when something doesn't fit into the structure you've built, it forces you to reconsider that structure, to question whether everything has been accounted for, and in doing so, it opens the door to possibilities you hadn't considered before. Possibilities that can't be easily dismissed once they start forming a pattern. She reached out, of course, trying to clarify, trying to correct what she believed was an error, because that's the natural response when something contradicts a confirmed outcome. You assume the system is wrong, not your understanding of it, and for a brief moment that belief likely held, because systems do make mistakes. Documents can be misfiled, information can be misinterpreted, but as more details began to surface, as more confirmations aligned with what that first letter suggested, the possibility of error started to fade, replaced by something far more unsettling, the realization that the situation wasn't incorrect, it was incomplete. That's when the questions began to change, shifting from "what is this?" to "how is this possible?" And that shift is critical, because it marks the point where confusion turns into concern, where something that seemed minor starts to take on a deeper significance. And as that concern grows, it creates a kind of pressure, a need to resolve the inconsistency, to find an explanation that restores the sense of control that has suddenly been disrupted. But the problem with situations like this is that the explanation doesn't restore control. It removes it entirely. The box, still unopened on my end, had already begun to do its work without being touched, because its impact wasn't dependent on immediate action. It was tied to the information it contained and the way that information was structured within systems that operate independently of personal expectations. And that's what made it so effective. It didn't rely on confrontation or revelation. It existed within a framework that would reveal itself gradually through processes that couldn't be easily stopped or redirected once they were set in motion. By the time she started connecting the pieces, it was already too late to change anything, not because there wasn't time, but because the mechanisms that governed those outcomes had already been activated, and once those mechanisms are in place, they follow their course regardless of how anyone feels about them. Because they aren't influenced by emotion or intention, they operate based on structure, on rules that don't adapt to sudden realizations or last-minute attempts to regain control. Her confidence, once steady and unquestioned, began to show signs of strain, not outwardly at first, but in the way she approached each new piece of information, more cautious, more deliberate, as if trying to anticipate what might come next. And that shift is significant, because it indicates a loss of certainty, a recognition that the situation is no longer fully understood. And when that happens, Every new detail carries more weight. Every update feels like it could change everything. What she didn't realize yet, what hadn't fully surfaced in her understanding, was that the box wasn't just a collection of information, it was a trigger. A starting point for a sequence of events that had been designed to unfold over time, not all at once because a single revelation can be resisted, challenged, even denied, but a series of confirmations, each building on the last, creates a momentum that becomes increasingly difficult to stop. Because with each step the situation becomes more defined, more concrete, leaving less room for interpretation. The second letter arrived shortly after, reinforcing what the first had introduced, adding clarity where there had been uncertainty, and with that clarity came a deeper realization. That this wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a miscommunication, it was something intentional, something structured, something that had been put in place long before the divorce was finalized, and that realization marked a turning point, because once intention is recognized, everything else starts to fall into place in a way that can't be ignored. And that's when the real tension began, not in the external situation, but internally, in the way she processed what was happening, because understanding that something was intentional raises a new question, one that's far more difficult to answer. Not what is happening, but why? And that question doesn't just seek information, it seeks meaning. It forces you to consider motives, timing, and the possibility that what you believed to be a completed situation was actually only part of a much larger design. From my side, everything remained still unchanged, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that needed to happen was already in motion. And that's the difference between reaction and preparation. Reaction requires constant adjustment, constant engagement, while preparation allows things to unfold without interference because the outcome has already been accounted for within the structure that was created. Her attempts to regain clarity became more frequent, more urgent, reaching out to professionals, reviewing documents, trying to identify the point where something might have gone unnoticed. But the more she searched, the clearer it became that nothing had been missed in the traditional sense. The information had always been there. It simply hadn't been recognized for what it was. And that distinction is important because it means the oversight wasn't in the system. It was in the perception of it. And perception, once proven incomplete, is difficult to trust again because it introduces doubt not just about the current situation, but about every decision that led to it, every assumption that was made along the way. And the doubt creates instability not externally, but internally, in the way future decisions are approached, in the way confidence is measured. By now the box had become something more than just an object. Even without being physically opened, it had transformed into a presence, something that influenced events without direct interaction. Something that existed as both a question and an answer, depending on how much of it had been revealed at any given moment. And the most unsettling part of it all was this, the realization that everything she thought she had taken had already been accounted for in a way she never saw coming. Because sometimes the real power in a situation isn't in what you fight for openly, but in what you prepare quietly, long before anyone realizes there's something to prepare for. By the time the third communication reached her, it was no longer possible to treat the situation as a misunderstanding, because patterns had started to form, and patterns are what turn isolated incidents into undeniable reality. They connect details in a way that forces recognition, removing the possibility of coincidence and replacing it with structure, and that structure is what made everything heavier, because it confirmed that what was happening wasn't random. It was intentional, designed, and already in motion long before she ever realized there was something to question. This time, the information was more direct, less open to interpretation, outlining specifics that tied together financial elements, legal acknowledgments, and recorded agreements that had been established independently of the divorce proceedings. And that independence is what made them so powerful, because they existed outside the framework she had relied on, meaning they weren't subject to the same assumptions, the same expectations, or the same control. And once something operates outside your field of influence, it becomes much harder to contain. The realization didn't come as a sudden shock, but as a gradual tightening, like a slow shift in pressure that becomes more noticeable with each passing moment. Because understanding something like this requires piecing together information that wasn't originally seen as connected. And once those connections start to form, they don't stop. They continue building, revealing layers that weren't visible before, each one adding more clarity and at the same time more weight to what it all meant. She began revisiting everything, not just the documents from the divorce, but the months leading up to it, searching for any indication that something like this had been developing without her awareness. And that process is where things often become clearer. Not because new information appears, but because existing information is viewed from a different perspective, one that allows previously ignored details to take on new significance. And that's when the box finally became relevant in a way that couldn't be ignored, not because she had seen it, not because she knew exactly what it contained, but because the effects of what was inside it had started to surface in a way that pointed back to something specific, something physical, something that existed outside the abstract structure of documents and agreements. Something that could hold the key to understanding how all of this had been set into motion. From my side, the moment had arrived, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that comes when everything has aligned exactly as expected. Because timing isn't about waiting for the perfect moment. It's about recognizing when the moment you prepared for has already begun, and acting in a way that allows the final pieces to fall into place without resistance. Opening the box didn't feel like an action. It felt like a confirmation, because everything it contained had already started to reveal itself indirectly, and what remained was simply the physical acknowledgement of what had been put into motion long ago: documents, records, and agreements that were structured not to create conflict, but to define outcomes in a way that couldn't be easily reversed once they were activated. Inside, everything was organized with precision, not excessive, not overwhelming, just enough to ensure that every piece served a purpose. Each document connected to another, forming a chain that extended beyond a single point of reference. And that's what made it effective, because it wasn't dependent on one element. It was built as a system, something that would hold together even if one part was questioned or challenged. What she had taken in the divorce was significant, but it was also surface level, tied to visible assets, to things that could be measured and transferred. But what the box represented was deeper. It was structural, embedded within systems that didn't rely on immediate visibility. Systems that operate on recorded agreements, on timelines, on conditions that once met, trigger outcomes automatically without requiring further input. And that's where the true shift occurred, not in the moment of discovery, but in the realization of scale. Because this wasn't about a single overlooked detail. It was about an entire layer of the situation that had been completely outside her awareness. Something that had been quietly shaping the outcome from the beginning without ever appearing as a factor to consider. The moment she understood that, everything else changed. Not externally at first, but internally in the way she processed what had happened. Because once you realize that something significant existed outside your understanding, it forces you to reconsider not just the situation, but your approach to it, your assumptions, your confidence in what you believe to be complete. Her next move wasn't immediate, because situations like this don't allow for quick reactions. They require recalibration, a shift from certainty to analysis, from control to understanding, and that shift takes time. Not because the information is unclear, but because its implications extend beyond the single action affecting everything connected to it. Meanwhile, the systems tied to the contents of the box continue to operate unaffected by hesitation or reconsideration. Because they weren't designed to pause or adapt, they were designed to execute, to follow a sequence that had already been defined. And once that sequence begins, it moves forward, regardless of how anyone feels about it. And that's what made the situation irreversible. Not the existence of the documents themselves, but the way they were integrated into processes that didn't require further approval. Processes that recognized conditions being met and responded accordingly, creating outcomes that couldn't simply be undone through negotiation or argument. Because in the end, the box wasn't just something I had kept hidden. It was something I had built piece by piece over time, not out of suspicion, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The understanding that control isn't about holding on to everything visibly. It's about structuring things in a way that ensures stability even when everything on the surface appears to be taken away. By the time everything connected fully in her mind, the realization didn't arrive as a sharp moment of clarity, but as a slow, undeniable collapse of everything she had believed to be secure, because when a structure is built on incomplete understanding, it doesn't just crack, it unravels piece by piece, each layer exposing another flaw beneath it, and that's what made this so difficult to process. Not the existence of the box itself, but what it represented, an entire dimension of control that had been operating silently outside her awareness, shaping the outcome long before she ever thought she had secured it. Her attempts to intervene became more focused, more deliberate, but also more constrained, because the realization that something is wrong doesn't automatically give you the ability to fix it, especially when the mechanisms behind it are already active, and that's the position she found herself in. Aware of the situation but unable to influence it in any meaningful way, because influence requires access, and access requires awareness at the right time, something that had already passed. The professionals she reached out to provided answers, but those answers didn't offer solutions. They clarified the situation in a way that made it even more concrete, confirming that the structures in place were valid, enforceable, and most importantly, already in motion. And that's the point where uncertainty disappears, replaced by something far more difficult to deal with: certainty without control. And certainty without control creates a unique kind of tension, because it removes the possibility of negotiation, of adjustment, of finding a way to shift the outcome, leaving only the reality of what has already been set into motion, and that reality doesn't respond to urgency or intent. It follows its own timeline, its own sequence, unfolding exactly as it was designed to. For her, that meant watching as elements she believed were fully hers began to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in ways that were structured and undeniable changes that were reflected in records, in confirmations, in systems that didn't require her approval to proceed, because the conditions tied to them had already been met, and once those conditions are satisfied, the outcome follows automatically. The house, the central piece of what she believed she had secured, became the focal point of that realization, not because it disappeared instantly, but because its status began to change in ways that revealed it had never been as firmly under her control as she thought, and that shift, subtle at first, carried implications that extended far beyond the property itself, because it represented a breakdown in the assumption that everything had been finalized. And that's when the emotional weight truly set in, not as an immediate reaction, but as a gradual understanding of what had been overlooked, because realizing that something was missed is one thing, but realizing that what was missed was central to the entire outcome is something else entirely, something that changes not just how you see the situation, but how you see every decision that led to it. From my perspective, nothing needed to be added, nothing needed to be explained, because everything that was happening was self-contained, built into the structure that had been created long ago. And that's the difference between confrontation and design. Confrontation requires engagement, explanation, justification, while design operates independently, allowing outcomes to unfold without the need for direct interaction. Her understanding reached a point where denial was no longer possible, not because she wanted to deny it, but because the consistency of what was happening removed any alternative interpretation. Each confirmation reinforcing the last, creating a chain of evidence that left no room for doubt, and that's what made it final, not a single moment, but the accumulation of undeniable proof. And in that accumulation, something shifted permanently, not just in the situation, but in her perception of it. Because once you see how something actually unfolded, you can't return to the version of it you believed before. You can't reconstruct the sense of control that existed when you thought everything had been accounted for, because now you know it wasn't. The power dynamic that had seemed so clear at the end of the divorce reversed itself quietly, not through confrontation, not through any direct action, but through the natural progression of the structures that had been put in place, and that reversal is what made it so effective. Because it didn't rely on force, it relied on inevitability. Her position, once stable and defined, became uncertain, not in a chaotic way, but in a structured one, where each step forward revealed another limitation, another boundary that couldn't be crossed. And that kind of limitation is different from resistance, because resistance can be challenged, but structure cannot. It simply exists enforcing its outcomes without negotiation. And that's where the true impact of the box revealed itself, not as a single moment of destruction, but as a controlled unraveling, a process that exposed the difference between what was assumed and what was real, and that difference is what ultimately defines situations like this, because it shows how easily perception can diverge from reality when key elements remain unseen. For her, the realization extended beyond the immediate situation, influencing how she viewed everything connected to it, not just the divorce, but the time leading up to it, the decisions that seemed logical at the time, the assumptions that felt justified, all of it taking on a different meaning when viewed through the lens of what had actually been happening beneath the surface. Because in the end, what had been taken wasn't everything. It was only what was visible and what remained. What had been quietly protected and structured in a way that didn't require visibility is what ultimately defined the outcome, proving that control isn't always about what you hold in plain sight, but about what you secure beyond it, by the time everything reached its final stage. There was no longer any confusion about what had happened, only a deep, unavoidable understanding of how it had happened, and that distinction is important because confusion allows for denial, for alternative explanations, but understanding removes all of that, leaving only the reality of the situation as it is, and that reality doesn't need to be dramatic to be powerful. It simply needs to be clear, because clarity once fully realized carries a weight that no reaction can reduce. The systems tied to the contents of the box completed their process with the same precision they had followed from the beginning, not accelerating, not hesitating, just continuing along the path that had been defined long before any of this became visible. And that consistency is what made it impossible to challenge, because it wasn't reactive. It didn't respond to pressure or urgency. It operated independently, following a sequence that had already accounted for every necessary condition. For her, the final confirmations didn't arrive as surprises anymore, because by that point the pattern had become clear enough that each new development was expected not in its exact form but in its direction, and that expectation changes how something is experienced. It removes the shock, but replaces it with something heavier, a steady awareness that what is happening cannot be altered, only observed as it unfolds. The house, once the center of everything she believed she had secured, no longer represented control or stability, but instead became a symbol of what had been misunderstood, because its status had shifted in a way that revealed it had never been entirely within her grasp. And that realization doesn't just change the meaning of the house, it changes the meaning of everything connected to it. And that's where the emotional impact reached its deepest point, not in loss itself, but in recognition, because losing something you thought you had is one thing, but realizing you never truly had it in the way you believed is something else entirely. Something that forces a complete reevaluation of how you understand ownership, control, and certainty. From my perspective, nothing needed to be said, nothing needed to be explained, because everything that mattered had already been revealed through the process itself. And that's the nature of well-structured outcomes. They don't require justification. They demonstrate their validity through consistency, through the way they unfold without contradiction. Her attempts to find a way around it eventually slowed, not because she gave up, but because there was nothing left to challenge. Every angle had been examined, every possibility considered, and each one led back to the same conclusion, that what had been set in motion was complete, not in the sense that nothing else would happen, but in the sense that nothing could change its direction. That's when acceptance began to take shape, not as agreement, not as approval, but as recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that the situation had reached a point where resistance no longer served a purpose. Because resistance requires the possibility of change, and once that possibility is gone, what remains is the need to understand rather than oppose. And in that understanding, something shifted internally, not immediately, but gradually. as the focus moved away from what had been lost and toward what had been learned, because situations like this, while defined by their outcomes, are ultimately shaped by the awareness they create, the way they change how future decisions are approached, how assumptions are evaluated. For me, the outcome wasn't about reversal or gain. It was about stability, about ensuring that regardless of what happened on the surface, there was a structure beneath it that would hold. And that's what the box had always represented. Not a weapon, not a secret, but a safeguard. Something designed not to destroy, but to protect against the possibility of losing everything. Because control in its truest form isn't about preventing others from acting. It's about ensuring that their actions cannot fully determine your outcome. And that's a distinction that often goes unnoticed until it becomes necessary. Until a situation arises where the difference between surface control and structural control becomes clear. Looking back, the divorce itself wasn't the defining moment. It was simply the point where everything that had been building beneath the surface became visible, where assumptions met reality, and where the difference between what was believed and what was true could no longer be ignored. And that's what makes situations like this so impactful. Not the events themselves, but the realization that comes from them. The understanding that what appears complete may not be, that what feels secure may already be shifting, and that control is often far more complex than it seems. Because in the end, the box didn't ruin her in the way people might expect. It didn't create chaos or destruction. It created clarity. And clarity, while not always dramatic, is often far more powerful because it reveals everything exactly as it is, without distortion, without assumption. And sometimes that's worse, because the most dangerous thing isn't losing everything, it's realizing too late you never actually had it.